Okay, so here we are at SBL in San Antonio for this panel on patristic research, patristic wisdom, possibilities and challenges, or challenges and possibilities, whichever is the more positive and uplifting. So today I'm Edwina Murphy, Australian College of Theology, and today I have with me from the end Geoff Dunn, Matt Crawford and Helen Rhee. So I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to talk first a little bit about their own research and what they're enjoying studying. So I'm going to start here with Helen. Helen, what's your field of research?
I started out, really being interested in 2nd and 3rd century apologists, and then apocryphal acts and martyr acts as separate bodies of literature. But in the in those bodies of literature, how they constructed Christian self-definition with regard to Christian monotheism, sexual ethics, and the loyalty to the Roman Empire. So that's my earlier work. And then I moved on to the topic of wealth and poverty in early Christianity, almsgiving, the organized care of the poor, particularly in the 2nd and 3rd century. So that research is more about how early Christian understandings of and practices of wealth and poverty impacted the formation of Christian self-definitions, Christian identities. And then more recently, I've been working on the early Christian engagement with Greco-Roman medicine and healthcare. Particularly, I draw on the medical anthropology and then try to show that Greco-Roman medicine and healthcare were indeed instrumental in shaping how Christians define themselves. So the common thread in this research journey is how all these, whether it be social, economic, or the medicine participation, all of those were kind of linked to Christian identity formation and how they define themselves vis-a-vis Greco-Roman culture and society.
Great, thanks Helen. And we're going to hear, we can already start thinking about how that relates to today, but we're going to save that for later. Okay, Matt.
Thanks, Edwina. It's a delight to be here and to be part of the panel. So my early work, my doctoral work was on Cyril of Alexandria, specifically as Trinitarian theology. Then thanks to an AHRC postdoc, I moved into New Testament reception studies, which led me to work on Tatian and the Diatessaron in the 2nd century and into the later Syriac world as well. And then secondly, on the Eusebian canon tables. And then once I had done some work in that area, thanks to an ARC grant, I was able to return to Cyril, my first love, and just wrapping up a major translation project of one of his understudied texts. So that will be sent off hopefully in the next week or two. And my next big project will be staying within the Alexandrian tradition, doing an edition and translation of Didymus the Blind's De Trinitate text, which is badly in need of a new edition and is hardly read. So I'll be working on a new edition and translation of that.
Thank you. And I've got more questions for you later too. But we'll go to Geoff first to tell us a bit about himself. Yes, Geoff.
Thanks, Edwina. My doctoral work was on Tertullian after having done some master's work on him some years earlier, and Tertullian's relationship with Jews, which involved me looking at classical rhetoric and its use in the patristic world. I was fortunate after that to have some time to work on an ARC project, Australian Research Council grant project on Cyprian. So I had a few years working on him, which resulted in a number of articles and in a book on Cyprian's relationship with the bishops of Rome. From there I've moved somewhat to looking at 5th century Roman bishops, wanting to produce a critical text edition of their letters. Does not exist, nor do English translations, nor do studies into these early 5th century Roman bishops, apart from Leo, exist. So that has consumed more time than I thought over the last 15 years. It's still not done. Other things get in the way. Tertullian keeps reaching out to me and dragging me back to the early 3rd century. So I'm finishing off a monograph on Tertullian's use of scripture. I'm halfway through another monograph on Tertullian and self-identity. the various bits and pieces of these papal decretal things is going on, and I hope to finish or rewrite a biography of Constantius III, Galla Placidia's husband. That it's finished but is being trimmed.
And I think you've just done a translation of some of Cyprian's works.
Oh yeah, that's next year coming out in
Right.
Ancient Christian Writers and
Yeah.
various bits and pieces.
So we're not completely bereft of, and I'm, my main research interest is Cyprian. The people here in the room probably already know that, but for you people, if anyone watches this on YouTube, now you know too, particularly his reception of scripture. But this brings me to one of the challenges that I can think of, although we've had a couple of translation projects. In Australia, translation isn't seen as research, and we're all about the research. So, but Matt, you've managed to get a grant for this research project, so tell us how that happens.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to mention there is that it's not an exclusively Australian problem.
Right.
So colleagues in America tell me that sometimes they have a very hard time getting translations to count for tenure dossiers. And then last night I was having dinner with a German colleague who said something similar obtains there. So it is frequently hard to make the case for those outside our discipline, which seems surprising because I think all of us very much see the value of it. I mean, it's sort of, whether we like it or not, what is translated becomes an effective canon of what ends up being read and worked with. And so the act of translation is an act of expanding the canon, but to make these texts more accessible. So I feel certainly a significant amount of luck went into getting the ARC grant for the translation, but it was packaged not simply as a translation. So it was various studies on the back of that as well. So there's a lot of interpretive work going on. And I was also able to make the case that it was a very timely undertaking because we had just had the culmination of a 2-decade-long research project to produce the first ever critical edition. And so now, in light of this critical edition, the urgent need was a translation. And so I was able to make a case for the sort of urgency of the task in light of that. So I think it is possible in certain contexts to use these kinds of arguments to make the case for the value of the translations, and hopefully people see that because I think it's likely to be the case that for many of us, whatever translating work we do will be the things that we write that are read the longest.
Yeah,
So,
that's right.
it has the longest lasting impact on the field.
Yes.
often.
And it's not that easy to make a translation, I don't think.
No,
I mean,
no.
yeah, it's almost like, oh, maybe a robot, maybe now AI can just, make this translation. You don't need to understand anything about the theology or the background. You just run it through the machine and pops out the other end. So the amount of scholarship you need to have in order to make a good translation, I think, is definitely underestimated. And Jeff, what do you think about I'm really glad that, as we heard, Lara was using some translations in her paper, or our paper, that are older. Like, it'd be great, like, I'm really desperate for some new Cyprian translations to come out.
It works on a number of levels for me. One is the stylistic issue, having translated and published translations of Tertullian, whose style, shall we say, is dense and dense. It's impossible to translate him easily. Cyprian is a lot easier to translate. He reads much more fluently. But again, it's still, I wrestle constantly with do I want the reader to appreciate what he's doing with his Latin, or do I want them to have a easy to read English translation? And I tend to err on the side of being a bit more literal. I was just reading my proofs, and I was thinking, what does that mean? What have I just translated? And I had to go and read it again, and it helped. I had to loosen it up a little bit, but I want to get the sense where he's got an obscure, not that he has often, but certainly with Tertullian, where he is obscure in his Latin, I want the English to be obscure rather than clear, to make, just to give a sense of what the original reader would have experienced. So that operates at that level as a translator looking at those kind of issues. why are we doing translation kind of broader question that Matt raised to me is, I'm a little bit free of that at the moment, but what I wanted to do with the Cyprian that's going to ancient Christian writers is to give a massive introduction that were I to justify myself to a university bean counter, I would say...
And we love those bean counters, just for the record, yeah.
I would say then I've written this 20,000, 25,000 word introduction. It's a piece of work in itself. I have extensive footnotes, which are a piece of work in themselves, and a little bit of this translation in the middle, which don't really worry about.
Yeah.
For those purposes, the work should be able to stand.
Yeah.
I would hope. And certainly for me, when I put the proposal in to the people at Paulist, I said, what I'm doing with Cyprian, I'm inspired by what Graham Clark did with the letters. You know, the way he approached that, to me, is the ideal of translation. It's massive footnotes that are just so extensive. That it really is a piece of research in itself. There's an enormous amount of evidence, and I've tried to do that with these two texts that are coming out next year. 300 or 400 footnotes per text that I've got. That may be reduced a little bit, but so it's not only, as Matt said, to put something out there that is in the hands of people that will be used more frequently than anything else we might do. But it's also to address those other pressures that we face. Yeah.
And of course, Graham Clark passed away this year. We count him as an Australian, and he was at ANU for many years. So he made a very important contribution to Cyprianic studies. Yes, Helen.
I'm not necessarily working in the critical sort of translation sort of project, but I've done one sort of editing and translation for the Fortress Press Ad Fontes sort of a series, so on wealth and poverty in early Christianity. So for me, when I think about translation, I mainly think about what kind of audience, who will be the main sort of a consumer and the readers of this book. So that's so the series is sort of designed for very much sort of general sort of readers. So I then try more of how the translation can be more readable rather than the textual or the more critical sort of aspect. So there's just another sort of aspect to think about the audience and the potential readers.
Thank you. So Helen, are there other challenges that you see for patristic studies in our time?
Challenges in a sense that, I'm just reminded of just a couple weeks ago, a few weeks ago, the NAPS, North American Patristic Societies, sent out the survey whether we should actually change the name of the patristics to something else, right? So usually then early Christian studies, or now with the discovery of a late antiquity. And Averill Cameron actually wrote an article in Journal of Early Christian Studies, patristics and late antiquity rivals or competitors or supporters, complementary sort of in relationship with each other. So the boundaries between what used to be called the patristics, strict patristics, more of philology, exegesis, and historical studies, and now it's moving to more of early Christian studies, last sort of decades of 20th century, more sociological, anthropological sort of broadening of the sort of scope, still sort of researching centered on early Christian studies, but with more kind of methodologies and broader topics like body and women and sexuality and slavery and law, different sort of aspects. Now, late antiquity, even more sort of broader topics or the methodologies, and even maybe moving away from the Christian sort of early Christian, what used to be the thought of the early Christian sort of topics per se, so including more Islam and Jewish late antique rabbinic literature and so on. So I think there's a very broad and sort of very porous, sort of open sort of fields. On the one hand, I think that's very exciting. And there's more sort of a cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary sort of opportunities and exciting sort of ways to, I mean, with also the material culture and art history and architecture and all that. So those are very exciting. At the same time, my question is then, in this sort of ever-broadening sort of fields of research and disciplines and so on, can patristics can still remain as patristics using all those interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary sort of tools in terms of where is the confessional sort of theology, the place of a confessional theology, or traditional sort of exegetical sort of a work, or the critical sort of a translation work. So, I mean, I do see, I mean, the quote, what we might call traditional patristic sort of topics or themes are not necessarily being diminished in the midst of all that, but is there more sort of still a sort of a space that is appreciated for what the patristics actually have been contributing to the field. And then just yesterday I was attending a session and a colleague actually quoted Jonathan Smith's words, which says, a historian's task is to complicate whatever theology, history, and the discourses, not to clarify it. And then,
say that again.
Yes, a historian's task is to complicate whatever the history or theology, the religion, or the discourses, not to clarify it. I think the current patristics or the early Christian studies and even late antiquity are really kind of good at complicating, those matters. So what we study and then what we appreciate. I'm just raising a question at this point. Is there any place to for any effort to clarify or elucidate or illuminate, right? Or is it even trying to find a broader sort of themes or unifying factors, or even the word for orthodoxy, is that still welcomed, or is that a more sort of lost cause these days?
Thanks, Helen. That's interesting. Jeff or Matt, would you like to play off what Helen's said?
Yeah, certainly. I see institutional challenges to the field, whatever we're going to call it. There are institutional challenges. You know, when you look at the colleagues who work in this area, and you would ask them, what department of a university do you work in? We all tend to work in different departments or different faculties depending upon what the university wants or needs or its direction is. So there are pressures about having an identity that influences that naming even that NAPS is looking at recently. I think, I had an interview for an American university position, and they asked me, was I a church historian or a historical theologian? And when I dared to say I do both, they couldn't believe that any one person could do both or would want to do both, that they're very distinct disciplines and have nothing to do with each other, which I found confusing, and therefore that's part of the challenge then of what exactly do we do?
Yeah, because you're a theologian and then break it down to historical theology, or you're a biblical studies person, or you're a historian. Yeah.
And then I think the same thing then, in a theology faculty, early Christian studies generally is such a small part of that. So it has institutional pressures when we're looking at what journals are recognised as leading in the field. If you're in a theology faculty, it's not going to be some of the journals in which we want to publish that will be recognised, because we're just on the fringes.
On the edge.
So building those relationships with systematic theologians, with the scripture people, with the late antique historians, with sociologists. There's a variety of relationships. So it's a wonderful Venn diagram and multicoloured. But it means that we don't have a clarity about who we are, perhaps. That's the institutional pressure.
Yes, Matt.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind for me, because these are the sorts of challenges that I feel most acutely at the moment, are wider sector-wide pressures. So we have a particular form of this in Australia, but I don't think that it's unique to us. So the sort of trend over the last several years has been towards increasing what they call industry engagement, or impact and engagement. Now it's industry engagement. And so the idea is that you have to show the relevance and justify your work in terms of the relevance to the contemporary world. And while I definitely think lots of the work that we do should end up having relevance in that kind of a way, it's becoming more and more a pressure to sort of define at the front end of the research agenda what that payoff in terms of relevance is going to be. And I think that ends up kind of short-circuiting the actual research that's meant to be done. And I mean, to go back to the quote that Helen mentioned a moment ago, the tendency there will inevitably not to complicate matters, but to have a simple straight line to whatever the relevant solution is that we're trying to find as the payoff to this bit of research. I think there's something similar, kind of similar dynamic with impact and engagement in the UK with their ref version, and then not quite so much in the US, but I do think you find another sort of version of that in the way the kind of pressures of social media, which is, you know, it tends towards these sort of small soundbite, again, not complicating things, but how can we sort of distill this down into the most sort of marketable, potentially viral kind of version of whatever this idea is. And I think at some level, that's all of that is inimical to the scholarly task, and we have to have the patience and the freedom to pursue the research questions that interest us, regardless of where they might end up leading. And eventually we will get there to some sort of relevance to the contemporary world, but you can't predetermine that from the outset. And increasingly I feel like that's what's trying to be done. And that's, I worry about that. And just one final thing, I think another way in which you see that is via grant funding bodies. So this is an opportunity. There's lots of grant funding bodies, and I don't just mean government bodies, but other foundations now that you can get funding from, and that's a wonderful opportunity. But that also means, to a large degree, they set the agenda. And that may not always be the same agenda that we ourselves would like to have for the research that we do and for the wider field. So there's both an opportunity and a challenge there to ensure that we're the ones that are setting the terms for what research needs to be done, rather than those who think it must be relevant for whatever the pressing issue is at the moment.
And I think we find that even in scientific discoveries, isn't it, that the people do some kind of what we call pure research that ends up having massive real life implications or usefulness, but that wasn't, you know, in scope when people were doing the research. That happens, you know, kind of separate. It was a happy outcome. So, or you can think of things growing in petri dishes that, you know, no one knew what they were. Yes, okay. So we've got a few challenges. We've started to hint at some of the possibilities. What are some of the positive things that people see happening? Start with you again, Matt, and then we'll. So you
Sure,
finished on
yeah.
that one. Now
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
go before we get to.
Happy to, yeah. So I mean, so we're coming out of the COVID years, of course. I mean, COVID is still with us, of course, so I don't mean to deny that. But we're sort of past the very, very disruptive phase where so much of our academic lives were really upended. And I think we're now at a point where we can think about what did we learn through that experience that now can improve the way that we do our craft going forward. One aspect of that, while I loathe virtual meetings in one sense, it is a significant instrument that we didn't have available in the same way that we had before. So if you have a particular author or text that you're interested in working on, and you can find enough other people around the world who want to read this same text with you, there's now nothing stopping you from setting up regular meetings to talk about the ideas, the text, the authors that you're interested in. So I think this is a real opportunity going forward that we're beginning to find ways to make best use of.
Thanks. Backwards, Jeff.
I wanted then, well, I'm going to steal from Helen, I guess. Yeah. You know, get in before she does. That there are these outreaches to other disciplines, to the late antique people, and that's a very broad field. It's not limited to the religious questions, to sociology, to other parts of the theological family, bringing all of that to bear on whatever it is that we do, and whichever part of that we emphasize as individuals more than any other part. So it's to ask new questions of old texts in new ways. All of that's very exciting, I think. Without denying that whatever we did in the past is no longer relevant. It remains relevant, but there are just so many opportunities, so many new ways of doing what we do that lead to new insights. And therefore, as Matt was saying, then that we live at a time where we can work cooperatively more easily. And there's a lot that comes from, well, I agree, I like the person-to-person interaction. So much more can happen by accident even, as well as planned, but that ability to bounce ideas off one another when we meet, rather than just that sense of us working in glorious isolation. There's a great opportunity and for that, and make a few notes, go home, think, and get a fresh impetus to keep on going.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, for example, this most recent project, so I use the methodology of a medical anthropology, and I found that really helpful, particularly their distinction between disease and illness, and the distinction between healing and cure. And I really found that helpful sort of distinctions to apply that to ancient Greco-Roman understandings of the more subjective sort of experience of the illness, and then in light of cultural, psychological, social, and religious sort of a context, rather than just focus on disease at its more biomedical sort of diagnosis. And so I'm more interested in this kinds of how Romans and then early Christians then brought their context to bear upon their chronic illness and pain, and then engagement with healthcare. So the plurality of the etiologies, how to explain the causes of sort of illness, really kind of match with the plurality of the the remedies. So this is just one example of how the use of incorporation and working with different disciplines is really helpful, and is a great sort of possibility. And then there is remedy groups, so religion, medicine, disability, health, sort of a working group among the scholars who are really interested in the Greco-Roman medicine, and then intersection with Christianity. And these days also a rising field of disability studies, and how actually we can work with also scholars in that field to think about the issues of disability and in ancient world, even migration studies now in light of all the sort of global sort of a migration that can also be helpful. So there are much greater sort of ways to not only employ and use this contemporary sort of methodologies, and hopefully carefully, right? Not in an anachronistic way, but apply them to shed light on what we do in the ancient world. But at the same time, then there is a more question of sort of then, is that relevance? Can we draw again the lessons, or kind of compare even what's happening actually in our contemporary sort of world, and then what happened then in our sort of own studies. I think there's more questions to really aspects to reflect and to relate to in some ways, even through our studies.
So, yes, thinking about collaboration and so on. I remember reading books, you know, when I was doing my thesis it was thinking about collaboration, and I'm like, oh, collaboration, you know, what's that all about? Really, you just get there and you do your work by yourself in our field, like computer science. You know, you're just doing your own thing, sitting there in your study, working away with your texts. But actually, I've found that somehow I've been involved in a lot of collaborations over the years. So it starts off in some sense, or I guess now I get what those authors were saying. You know, working with other people, doing edited volumes, or being part of a section like this, or International Patristic Society, or whatever. That opportunity to collaborate is some of the most fun stuff, and that's what's nice about coming to a conference and being able to see people and talk together and share ideas and develop things. So thinking about what we've done and the wisdom, I call it patristic wisdom. Is there wisdom? We've talked about using new methodologies and considering you know, current issues and how we can use text. Is there wisdom to be found in this era for today? And if so, what is it? Or can we define it? Or are different authors helpful in different ways? Or and how can we avoid, I guess, misappropriating what's there? I mean, we see a lot of people misappropriating, say, classical ideas and applying them to our own time, maybe somewhat incorrectly. So, is there patristic wisdom, and how can we access it? Anyone can go first.
I'm happy to speak at least briefly to that from, in light of a personal, or not personal, but our current research project that we have ongoing at ACU. So a couple of years ago, we launched what we intend to be a 5-year research project on flourishing in early Christianity.
Right.
And a part of that project is very deliberately attempting to bring our ancient sources into dialogue with contemporary discussions of human flourishing. And that's in a couple of different ways. You have lots of investigation at the moment and discussion of human flourishing and positive psychology, but then also in, say, Martha Nussbaum capabilities theory as well. And so what we're trying to do is to put our sources in dialogue with those contemporary theories with a few different goals. I mean, one would be to help those people involved in those other discussions to recognize the time-boundedness of their own assumptions that often go unquestioned, that there were other views of what constituted human flourishing throughout different historical periods and even around the world today probably, and so we need to be aware of those differences. But then also I think in sort of more content-focused ways, our ancient sources have things that they can contribute that maybe capture better aspects of the human experience than certain versions of a positive psychology approach might be. So an issue like vulnerability and suffering, for example, could be one example where our ancient sources have much to contribute to these contemporary discussions. And we've been pleased, we've found a great deal of openness from people involved in these other disciplines to hearing what our ancient sources have to offer there. So that's one aspect from our recent experience.
Great. Jeff?
I just think of the two works of Cyprian on pestilence that I've translated, which I deliberately chose. It was to jump on a COVID bandwagon to try and find something that was relevant to the contemporary world. They're works I've worked with a lot before, but translating them gave me new insights, but doing it in the post-COVID world was also a very valuable exercise. The reason I wanted to do them was that the experience in those early months of COVID was of it seemed to me, a world feeling helpless. There was nothing we could do to stop this. And I thought to myself, this is probably the closest, particularly Western society, is ever going to get to the experience that would have operated in those first few centuries. We had no power over this disease. And it seemed like everybody who got it was incredibly sick and the death rate was high. So how would a modern Western person understand this without the controls that we have from modern medicine. And so I wanted to look at that, and I could see that at work here. You know, the fear you see expressed by the reactions of people blaming each other, you're the cause of this disease, no, you are, made a lot of sense. But interestingly enough then to see, which I had never really appreciated before, for example, you know, Cyprian's whole thing was disease, good, bring it on, because we don't like this world much, we want to get to the next world. Anything that gets us there quicker the better. And this whole, you know, I don't want a cure sort of attitude, I thought, yeah, that would be very challenging. You know, Christianity today couldn't really, mainstream Christianity, I don't think, could really take that stand and put forward the eschatological perspective and say, let COVID rip, that's what we're hoping, end of the world. You know, things of centuries of experience have altered that perspective. So to see that, the challenges of that. So there's some links that way. Because I've always thought the pre-Nicene early Christian world is a world very much worth exploring as the world in which we live becomes less overtly Christian, or the structures of society are less influenced by Christian thinking. What's the role of Christianity in the broader society in a truly post-Constantinian environment? And can we look again at how those people saw themselves and their role? And that's why I think that the other thing then, that it's interesting to see where early Christian studies is happening in the world in non-traditional parts of that world. So that, you know, for me, working with colleagues in Asia where Christianity is not the dominant religion, and to see how they see themselves and how they understand these texts in a world where they're under pressure or challenged, I find incredibly insightful.
Yeah, so it's coming from that more marginalised place than compared to when you get to Augustine or others.
And even when you look at the post-Nicene church then, and that whole, why is it that the church fitted in and allowed itself to be fitted into a society that appropriated it and did all kinds of things to it, and yeah, to see, okay, what's that challenge then for modern Christians and how we work with the society around us? Yeah,
thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, so kind of relating to both actually Matt and Jeff said, for example, for the more recent field that I've been working on, so I just find very generally sort of the ancient medicine in general is very holistic.
Right.
And you know, the exercise, diet, food, and you know, sex, and all this is all part of the sort of a health regimen, and including actually the doctors and the Galen and Hippocrates on how they relate to gods, and then so religious sort of beliefs, and then context is all part of the sort of how the person experiences illness and expresses actually their own suffering. And I see that now more sort of a contemporary medicine is kind of getting a little bit sort of a more open to this functional sort of medicine, and more open, more holistic sort of approach, rather than, you know, just very, you know, Cartesian sort of a dualistic sort of approach, which actually reigned in the 19th, 20th century and so on. So that's, I think it's a good sort of a turn that where we can actually talk more about the cultural, social, and religious sort of aspect of experiencing illness, and whether that could be part of sort of a legitimate sort of a process of a remedy, for example. And also in terms of wealth and poverty sort of issues, and when we think about how the early church in general, and particularly, you know, the fathers talked about the material things and the transitory nature of those, and then sort of such contrast with laying on the heavenly treasures in heaven. So I think sometimes, particularly in the West, we need a little more of that kind of sort of a perspective for us to be more grounded, and then in understanding of what does it mean to confess faith or Christianity, and then also studying the Christianity in a helpful way that can orient sort of people to be more generous and to be also more think about again the ancient sort of conceptualization, understandings of the impact of the material sort of things on us, our psyche, and then behaviors, and then our sense of security. So I think that could be a sort of healthily corrective in some ways, in particularly modern contemporary Western understanding of money and possessions and wealth, and so on.
And that comes out in Cyprian's, on the play, like the temporal versus the eternal.
Exactly.
Like, actually, we're all going to die one day. Sorry to break the, news to you. And so, it doesn't. Sometimes modern Western Christians, I'm including myself, act as if Jesus never said anything about storing up treasures in heaven. I mean, obviously that part's we're like crossing out, we might be masked or whoever, crossing out texts in our Bible, the ones we don't like, for all that we notice them or appreciate them. So, those areas of, where's the temporal versus the eternal, which of course Cyprian's very big on. Where do you put your security? Is it in your, we had earlier from the pride of, having power now, or having wealth now, or having health now? But I also find it funny that a lot of those ideas about, human flourishing, it's a new thing. We just discovered positive psychology, like in the past 20 odd years, as if it's not already, a few thousand years old, or, the holistic, the whole body and the whole, as if like that's a new thing, whereas, as opposed to just scientific cures or whatever. So, I think that a lot of the things which are new are actually, thousands of years old. And as we learn to handle those sources correctly and with the right perspectives, we can contribute a lot to our own world. So I want to thank our panel for today, Geoff Dunn, Matt Crawford, Helen Rhee, myself, Edwina Murphy, and thank you very much. Thank you.